Carbon neutral claims. Risky. We all want our food to be sustainable, and consumers are increasingly willing to pay for sustainable foods. As a result, more food companies are reducing their carbon emissions and making claims about carbon reduction on food packages. Carbon neutral claims are on the rise with carbon neutral eggs, carbon neutral dairy foods, and even carbon neutral packaged water available. The problem is that carbon neutral claims are controversial, with some people arguing that the carbon offsetting used to achieve carbon neutrality would not fit with an average consumer's understanding of a carbon neutral food product. First, some definitions. A carbon neutral product is one that does not add any net new greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. Carbon neutrality is achieved by reducing emissions and by offsetting emissions. Carbon offsetting means absorbing an equivalent amount of carbon dioxide to that which is emitted. This is achieved by investing in carbon capture projects like reforestation. To buy carbon offsets, a company can purchase carbon credits. Carbon credits are tradable units that each represent 1 tonne of a CO2 equivalent greenhouse gas, 1 tonne of CO2 equivalent greenhouse gases that have either been removed from the atmosphere or have been avoided. Projects that avoid greenhouse gas emissions include renewable energy infrastructure creation, which avoids fossil fuel electricity production, and energy efficiency initiatives that reduce the need for fossil fuel-derived energy. The problems with offsets. Offsets are only supposed to be used if emissions are unavoidable, which is somewhat subjective. For example, an airline that purchases carbon offsets because their use of aviation fuel is unavoidable could instead choose to transport their passengers by sailing boat and thereby remove their need altogether for aviation fuel. Number 2, some offsets are better than others. When we buy carbon credits to offset emissions, we are supposed to be contributing to a method that directly captures or reduces greenhouse gas emissions because of our investment. If that reduction would have happened anyway, then we aren't really doing anything useful. For example, solar and wind energy generation projects are booming in some areas, and investment is abundant. Purchasing carbon credits for those projects does not actually increase the overall benefits gained in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, since those projects would have happened anyway. This is the notion of additionality. Additionality is the word used to describe carbon credits that add to our overall emissions reduction activities rather than just contributing finance to an activity that would have happened anyway. Some offsets may not actually work. Offsets are supposed to actively cancel out emissions, but carbon offset projects such as those that involve planting trees can take years or even decades to capture the promised amount of CO2. When trees die, they ultimately release the captured carbon back into the atmosphere, making them a poor choice compared to leaving fossil fuels in the ground in the first place. The risks posed by carbon neutral claims. More people are becoming aware of the problems associated with offsetting, and that poses a risk for food companies that use offsets to make carbon neutral claims. For example, Danone Waters America, the owner of the Evian brand, is facing a lawsuit for using carbon offsets that, according to the complainant, do not currently reduce CO2 emissions. Now, Evian wasn't making random, unsubstantiated Wild West claims about their carbon neutrality. They took a careful and conservative approach. They chose the most universally accepted standard for carbon neutrality, which is past 2060, and they had their compliance independently verified and certified by the certification body Carbon Trust. Carbon offsets are allowed under the past 2060 standard, and not just any old offset, but only those with additionality and from schemes that have been checked and approved by past 2060 and which have been independently verified and certified. What Evian did for their carbon neutral project is all above board, at least as far as the past 2060 standard is concerned. But would consumers be okay with Evian's use of these high-quality certified carbon credits? Climate advocates say they would not. The plaintiffs in the case against Evian's brand owner argue that consumers' understanding of carbon neutral would not include carbon offset schemes that do not produce actual carbon gains in the present. They argue that carbon offsets from tree plantations may be years away from any meaningful reduction in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and that this means the products are not currently carbon neutral as understood by consumers. In the USA, companies are not supposed to use long timeframe carbon offsets without disclosing this to the public. These rules are set by the Federal Trade Commission in a document known as the FTC Green Guide, which provides guidelines for making green marketing claims. They include a recommendation that companies disclose if they use offsets that won't reduce emissions for 2 years or more. What will the court say? The Evian case has not started at the time of writing. But when courts in any country review claims of this nature, they almost never rely on voluntary standards like PAS 2060. They usually seek to understand what an average consumer would expect in relation to the claim. If this varies significantly from what the brand owner can actually demonstrate, then the court will find that the claim is misleading, and this will result in punishment for the brand owner. Recommendations for food companies. Food companies that seek to make carbon neutral claims should invest in comprehensive consumer research that is specific to the actual food products about which the claims will be made. This is in addition to meeting the requirements of trusted publicly available standards. The consumer research will help to refine messaging and could be used in a court of law to demonstrate that the claims are not misleading to consumers. As consumers' attitudes change over time, the research will need to be repeated every few years so that claims remain calibrated with expectations. The use of carbon offsets is a controversial element in any carbon neutral claim. Carbon offsets that do not clearly demonstrate additionality and those with long lead times before carbon capture occurs are risky with respect to consumer expectations. Food companies might do well to avoid such offsets. Foods marketed in the USA may be subject to the FTC Green Guide recommendations regarding offsets, and they might be in conflict with carbon offsets that are allowed under voluntary standards such as PAS 2060. So that's something to be aware of as well. And the sources, as always, are in the email.